Hey there, I'm Kyle Pinion, film critic, author of a book that you'll hopefully see relatively soon, and rehabilitated comics journalist as well. You may have seen my work over at comicsbeat.com sometimes, if you happen to enter on that side of the web. This is my booktube channel. I read a lot of books. That's my big hobby, and I am looking to sort of create a space where I can talk about them and maybe even hopefully have some fun conversations with people who share the same interests as me. My reading tends to function and flow around fantasy, horror, science fiction. I'm a big horror junkie especially. But I also enjoy a little bit of crime. I like a little bit of lit fic as well. So I like Murakami and Carver just as much as I like Dick and Ellison. So the first things first, before we talk about the book I'm going to talk about, I also want to mention that most of my videos, if I get things, I want to share those at the end too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my recent pickups as I get them, because like every good book collector, you pick up more things than you actually have time to read, which is a sad admission, but that is just how it works. So it goes. Let's talk about The Talisman. Now, by Stephen King and Peter Straub. Now, I have read 15 King books to date. This is the 15th I've read. I've read only 2 Straub books, if we count this as the second Straub book, this collaboration. And I think it is a really fascinating entry point in the sort of literary conversation and back and forth between King and Straub, which is maybe to me even more interesting than the book itself. But I'll touch on that in just a second. But first things first, I want to talk about this cover. Now, I am not the biggest fan of a lot of King reissues that I see. I tend to think they look a bit like Photoshop nightmares. I've seen some recent covers of things like Pet Sematary. It has like this Photoshop cat photo on it. And some others that just I don't think look very good. And even more recent reissues, like I think they just put out a new Pet Sematary, a new Cujo, a new edition of Christine with like sort of this AI looking livery. I'm not sure if it's actually AI, but it certainly gives off that impression. I hope that's not the case. But to me, like I think an author like King deserves a little bit better work than that. And luckily, I'm happy to say, I think this Talisman cover is really spectacular. And I think it looks better than the original hardcover, to be honest with you. It gives off the real sort of Amblin feel and sheen of the story, which it really is. I mean, when I was reading this, my first thought, among many, was that this was sort of the Steven Spielberg version of The Dark Tower and sort of a proof of concept for where King would be taking that larger mythos throughout his entire work, really. His whole corpus is centered on the Dark Tower now. But this was kind of like a prototype in its own way, post The Gunslinger. Now, I understand the sequel goes even further into that. I have not read the sequel yet, but hopefully I will be able to do so, good Lord willing. But let me talk a little bit about Straub and King first before I talk about this book. Now, Straub and King, they both have been writing since the early to mid 70s, really late 60s actually, writing short stories and poetry in Straub's case. But King's big breakthrough was in Carrie. Straub didn't have his breakthrough until later. But they had kind of an interesting creative back and forth, and the immediate sort of corollary that I think of is the Beatles and the Beach Boys, or are the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the Beatles album Rubber Soul inspired the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds then inspired Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper then inspired Beach Boys' Smile. So you had sort of this back and forth and competitiveness between the two bands. I don't think it was quite the same with Straub and King, because I think they were quite cordial, and I think there was like a good friendly relationship rather than sort of a competitive one, but maybe there was. I don't know the guys. But when Salem's Lot came out in the mid-70s, that inspired Peter Straub to expand his horror work to a degree that he decided to create Ghost Story, which has sort of the same sort of expansive feel with a larger cast and a bigger canvas to work off of. Now, Ghost Story, of course, then in turn inspired King to eventually write his great American horror masterpiece, It. Now, for those of you who don't know, It was actually written in the early 80s, even though it wasn't released until 1986. He had started the manuscript around 1981, I would say. But what's funny is, rather than Straub being immediately inspired by It, he was writing his own work that was quite similar to it at the exact same time in terms of Floating Dragon, or called Floating Dragon. Now, what's funny about these books is that they both sort of focus on a larger evil that impacts one geographic area and it returns every few decades. And there's like an intergenerational piece between the two of them, and they both sort of focus on the struggles of childhood, and there's just a lot between them that like has this shared DNA, despite the fact that neither book had been available to the other author to inspire them. So I think what happened, based on an interview I saw with Straub, he said that he had exchanged manuscripts between Floating Dragon and It with King, and they had noted those similarities. And I think at that point, that is when they were inspired to work together to craft the Talisman. So that relationship, rather than creating more competition, actually created collaboration, which I think is really fascinating. Now, onto the Talisman itself. It's a bit like an isekai, one of the most popular forms of anime right now, maybe the most popular form. And it's not something I'm really an expert in. I'm only sort of vaguely familiar with it. But I am more familiar with portal fantasies, which are basically the same thing. This is a genre or subgenre of fantasy that is like stretched back really to the turn of the century, if not before. I mean, we have works like the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. We've got the Narnia books. You've got The City of the Singing Flame by Clark Ashton Smith. So this is something that is like really intrinsic to fantasy. It's not new, you know. It is something that has existed for a very long time, and this was King and Straub's spin on it. The fascinating thing about the Talisman, and I'll get to sort of a brief overview of it, but the fascinating piece to me is that not only is it their spin on the portal fantasy, but it's also their spin on sort of the road trip storytelling of Mark Twain. That's not really a revelation, because the book opens with quotes from Tom Sawyer, but I think that really gives the game away. And once you look at it through that lens specifically, it becomes a much more rewarding read, especially for someone who is interested in the history of literature. Now, the Talisman, it's about a young boy named Jack Sawyer who goes to this hotel with his I'm sad to say, I don't want to use washed up, but his actress mother, who is no longer working, and they go to this hotel. He's very bored. He ends up meeting with an employee of the hotel and the sort of local area named Speedy Parker. Speedy actually has an interesting origin in that he is intrinsically tied to another land called the Territories. And he informs Jack that, no, your mother is not doing well at all. She's actually dying, and only you can save her. And so he is sort of the impetus for Jack being able to jump between the Territories and our world in his quest to find the titular talisman, the only thing that will save his mother from dying from cancer. At the same time, Jack's uncle, which is really just his deceased father's best friend, has some nefarious goals in mind, and he is looking to chase down Jack as Jack is off on his own and jumping between these two worlds to try and discover the talisman, and his uncle Morgan is attempting to stop him. That's kind of the larger just plot struggle in the book, and I think it makes for an interesting dynamic, especially when one considers how the world of the Territories is built. There are two key things that stuck with me about the Territories. One is that that when you're inside the Territories, when you travel, and then you jump back into our world, you've actually traveled further, despite the fact that the territories are smaller. So like you could walk, I don't know, 100 feet in the territories, and you would end up walking 5 miles in our world. So, or it's probably more than that. I've forgotten the actual measurement that they give in the book. But it is a really cool way to get Jack somewhere very quickly. That sort of dilation of distance. On top of that, the book is also operating on this concept of twinners. So Jack does not have a twinner in the territories. His twinner died. But Morgan, his uncle, has a twinner who is called Morgan of Orus. And whenever Morgan jumps into the territories, he takes over the mind or the body, of Morgan of Orus, wherever Morgan of Orus is. And this is how it typically works for anybody that's jumping between the territories in our world. But Jack's twinner died. So Jack is singular, and he has the ability to jump between the worlds at will, and anywhere, whatever the distance equivalent is in our world to the territories, he can go there. So that gives Jack a lot of flexibility, and I think that's pretty fascinating too. The other thing that I was really a big fan of here in this book was the partnerships that Jack meets along the way. I would say about a quarter to almost halfway through the book, Jack meets a werewolf named Wolf, who is sort of a big lumbering fella, really sweethearted, and I think he's kind of a big favorite of a lot of fans of the book. He reminds me a lot of Jim from Huckleberry Finn, and I think they have that kind of relationship, even down to to Jack being carried on Wolf's back sometimes. And that you have that one relationship, and then on the other hand, Jack is also looking for his good friend, the son of Uncle Morgan, Richard, who was at a private boarding school over in Illinois. And when they connect, the relationship morphs into something that's a bit like Frodo and Sam, who King, of course, is a big fan of The Lord of the Rings. So that's no big surprise, too. All in all, I like The Talisman quite a bit. I have some qualms about it, particularly in how it kind of, I think it defies its own rules occasionally. I think it's really consistent when it comes down to Jack's travels and Jack's abilities to jump between the two worlds. I don't think that there's really any sort of betrayal of the rules as they're set therein. But occasionally with Morgan and his twinner, I had some issues with, like, how is it Morgan's able to jump physically between these two worlds, even though he's not supposed to be able to do that? I also just think that there's some issues occasionally, like, where is Speedy at times? Like, how is Speedy able to get to certain places? A lot of these things aren't explained. And I feel like the better answer would be to just kind of take on the old Mystery Science Theater saying you should really just relax and just enjoy the ride, really. But this is a thing that does stick in my craw just a hair. But I think maybe the ending too, when I think about it, there's a big dollop of cheese there that makes it just a little less satisfying than some of the better King works are. But all in all, I think it is a good read. I think it's essential too if you become a Dark Tower fan or are a Dark Tower fan. I've seen some really cool maps that some fans have made that actually place the territories within the overall sphere of Midworld and All-World, which gives it a little extra oomph for me. It's the reason I went ahead and read it anyway. So yeah, The Talisman, really cool for the most part, beyond just a couple qualms I have. I would also say that what's neat is you can't really tell who wrote what, which that's kind of remarkable, because I think King and Straub have very different writing styles. King is a little more colloquial, whereas Straub is a little more literary. But other than just a few tiny things where you'll see a section where the narrator will say, no big loss, which reminds me quite a bit of something that comes from The Stand, or the name Richard Sloat and Morgan Sloat. Those sound like names that only Peter Straub would come up with. And if you know authors well enough, you know that they're very particular and have a lot of tells when it comes with the names they create. There's just a rhythm there. Even I fall prey to it very often. But otherwise, it's just like a really smooth work. And I don't know if that was the work of editors or if that was just something that they did together when they were drafting this, and it was just something that just came out through the work itself. But either way, very fascinating book. I do recommend it with some caveats. So now let's talk about the things that I just recently got very quickly. Christopher Rucchio, I don't know. His Diamond edition of Empire Silence just arrived after we had, we had collectively, I say we being the fans who kickstarted it, we kickstarted about a year ago. So this is the first part of the Sun Eater saga. I've not read any of this before. So you're probably going to ask yourself, why in the world did you buy something you haven't read yet? Well, I don't know, man. You know, it's just the way it is, I guess. But this is a space opera, very similar to Dune, very similar to The Name of the Wind in terms of its first-person POV. Also, a lot of people say there's comparisons to the Book of the New Sun, which that makes me very excited as a Wolf diehard. So I'm looking forward to reading this. And we'll see if the hype lives up at all. Also, I got a John Collier book called Fancies and Good Nights. Now, I recently started reading The Dark Descent to get ahead of spooky season, which was this big David Hartwell anthology. And on the cover was the name John Collier, right there with Stephen King and with Shirley Jackson and Ray Bradbury and Clive Barker and all these really notable names. And I thought, I'd never heard of John Collier before. And I feel like I'm kind of decently well read. Well, I read his story, which was called Evening Primrose. And it's a really spectacular story about a guy, a poet specifically, who decides, I'm just gonna eject myself from the modern world and from society in general, and he decides to set up shop within a department store. Unfortunately for him, or fortunately, a whole lot of other people had the same idea, and they have their own little society with a really dark underlayment throughout, particularly when it comes to the creation of mannequins. And it's a story I really recommend, and I liked it so much I had to get this NYRB edition of what is kind of the only book of his that is currently available. So I'm looking forward to reading this. My favorite booktuber on YouTube, The Outlaw Bookseller, is always talking about NYRB, the New York Review of Books, and this is where my collection of this is going to start. I think this is going to be a lot of trouble, guys. I think I'm going to buy a lot of these, so hopefully I can read them before I buy more, but no promises. And last but not least, I have not read a lot of comics in a while. I don't really buy comics regularly anymore. It's just, there's no real reason for it other than just it's kind of a pain in the butt to go to the store all the time and to keep up with it. And I just don't get a lot out of the medium anymore. But I could not resist the Triangle Omnibus. These were the Superman comics I grew up with as a kid. And for those of you who weren't around during the era of the Triangle era of Superman, the Triangle storytelling, this was when they had like a writer's room and the books would come out. I think it was like the late 80s, early 90s, really, excuse me, late 80s, all the way to the end of the 90s, actually, but I kind of dropped off around 96 or so. But they would all have like little triangles, and numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was the order of the different books that came out every week that you'd read them in. And that writer's room kind of bounced around different subplots, different cast members, and it was really one big connected universe in a way that I think comics don't do as well anymore because they're so concerned about sort of the standalone nature of trying to get new readers on board. They threw that completely out of the water back then. And so this was their long form soap opera storytelling that I mean, it's never really been replicated as far as I know, and I ate it up as a kid. We'll see how it lives up to sort of my adult eyes. I have not read a Superman comic in some time, and I have definitely not looked at these since they came out. But the nostalgia rush was inescapable. Anyway, that's my haul. Thanks for checking out my first episode of my channel. I will see you guys hopefully on a semi-weekly basis. Thanks so much again, and talk to you soon.